Chapter 16 of Little Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Little Men, Life at Plumfield with Joe's Boys by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 16, Taming the Colt. "What in the world is that boy doing?" said Mrs. Joe to herself as she watched Dan running around the half-mile triangle as if for a wager. He was all alone and seemed possessed by some strange desire to run himself into a fever, or break his neck, for after several rounds he tried leaping walls and turning somersaults up the avenue, and finally dropped down on the grass before the door as if exhausted. "Are you training for a race, Dan?" asked Mrs. Joe from the window where she sat. He looked up quickly and stopped panting to answer with a laugh, "No, I'm only working off my steam." "Can't you find a cooler way of doing it? You will be ill if you tear about in such warm weather," said Mrs. Joe, laughing also, as she threw him out a great palm leaf fan. "Can't help it. I must run somewhere," answered Dan, with such an odd expression in his restless eyes that Mrs. Joe was troubled and asked quickly, "Is Plumfield getting too narrow for you?" "I wouldn't mind if it was a little bigger. I like it, though. Only the fact is, the devil gets into me sometimes, and then I do want to bolt." The words seemed to come against his will, for he looked sorry the minute they were spoken, and seemed to think he deserved a reproof for his ingratitude. But Mrs. Joe understood the feeling, and though sorry to see it, she could not blame the boy for confessing it. She looked at him anxiously, seeing how tall and strong he had grown, how full of energy his face was, with its eager eyes and resolute mouth. Remembering the utter freedom he had known for years before, she felt how even the gentle restraint of this home would weigh upon him at times when the old lawless spirit stirred in him. "Yes," she said to herself, "my wild hawk needs a larger cage, and yet, if I let him go, I am afraid he will be lost. I must try and find some lure strong enough to keep him safe. I know all about it," she added aloud. "It is not the devil, as you call it, but the very natural desire of all young people for liberty. I used to feel just so, and once I really did think for a minute that I would bolt." "Why didn't you?" said Dan, coming to lean on the low window ledge with an evident desire to continue the subject. "I knew it was foolish, and love for my mother kept me at home." "I haven't got any mother," began Dan. "I thought you had now," said Mrs. Joe, gently stroking the rough hair off the hot forehead. "You are no end good to me, and I can't ever thank you enough. But it just isn't the same, is it?" And Dan looked up at her with a wistful, hungry look that went to her heart. "No, dear, it is not the same, and never can be. I think an own mother would have been a great deal to you. But as that cannot be, you must try to let me fill her place. I fear I have not done all I ought, or you would not want to leave me," she added sorrowfully. "Yes, you have," cried Dan eagerly. "I don't want to go, and I won't go if I can help it. But every now and then I feel as if I must burst out somehow. I want to run straight ahead somewhere, to smash something, or pitch into somebody. Don't know why, but I do, and that's all about it." Dan laughed as he spoke, but he meant what he said, for he knit his black brows and brought down his fist on the ledge with such force that Mrs. Joe's thimble flew off into the grass. He brought it back, and as she took it she held the big brown hand a minute, saying, with a look that showed the words cost her something, "Well, Dan, run if you must, but don't run very far, and come back to me soon, for I want you very much." He was rather taken aback by this unexpected permission to play truant, and somehow it seemed to lessen his desire to go. He did not understand why, but Mrs. Joe did, and knowing the natural perversity of the human mind, counted on it to help her now. She felt instinctively that the more the boy was restrained, the more he would fret against it, but leave him free, and the mere sense of liberty would content him, joined to the knowledge that his presence was dear to those whom he loved best. It was a little experiment, but it succeeded, for Dan stood silent a moment, unconsciously picking the fan to pieces and turning the matter over in his mind. He felt that she appealed to his heart and his honor, and owned that he understood it by saying presently, with a mixture of regret and resolution in his face, "I won't go yet awhile, and I'll give you fair warning before I bolt. That's fair, isn't it?" "Yes, we will let it stand so. Now, I want to see if I can't find some way for you to work off your steam better than running about the place like a mad dog, spoiling my fans, or fighting with the boys. What can we invent?" And while Dan tried to repair the mischief he had done, Mrs. Joe racked her brain for some new device to keep her truant safe until he had learned to love his lessons better. "How would you like to be my expressman?" she said, as a sudden thought popped into her head. "Go into town and do the errands?" asked Dan, looking interested at once. "Yes. Franz is tired of it. Silas cannot be spared just now, and Mr. Bear has no time. Old Andy is a safe horse, you are a good driver, and you know your way about the city as well as a postman. Suppose you try it, and see if it won't do most as well to drive away 2 or 3 times a week as to run away once a month." "I'd like it ever so much, only I must go alone and do it all myself. I don't want any of the other fellows bothering round," said Dan, taking to the new idea so kindly that he began to put on business airs already. "If Mr. Bear does not object, you shall have it all your own way. I suppose Emil will growl, but he cannot be trusted with horses, and you can. By the way, to-morrow is market day, and I must make out my list. You had better see that the wagon is in order, and tell Silas to have the fruit and vegetables ready for mother. You will have to be up early and get back in time for school. Can you do that?" "I'm always an early bird, so I don't mind," and Dan slung on his jacket with dispatch. "The early bird got the worm this time, I'm sure," said Mrs. Joe merrily. "And a jolly good worm it is," answered Dan, as he went laughing away to put a new lash to the whip, wash the wagon, and order Silas about with all the importance of a young expressman. "Before he is tired of this I will find something else and have it ready when the next restless fit comes on," said Mrs. Joe to herself, as she wrote her list with a deep sense of gratitude that all her boys were not Dan's. Mr. Bear did not entirely approve of the new plan, but agreed to give it a trial, which put Dan on his mettle, and caused him to give up certain wild plans of his own, in which the new lash and the long hill were to have borne a part. He was up and away very early the next morning, heroically resisting the temptation to race with the milkman going into town. Once there, he did his errands carefully, to Mr. Bear's surprise and Mrs. Joe's great satisfaction. The Commodore did growl at Dan's promotion, but was pacified by a superior padlock to his new boathouse and the thought that seamen were meant for higher honors than driving market wagons and doing family errands. So Dan filled his new office well and contentedly for weeks, and said no more about bolting. But one day Mr. Bear found him pummeling Jack, who was roaring for mercy under his knee. "Why, Dan, I thought you had given up fighting," he said as he went to the rescue. "We ain't fighting, we are only wrestling," answered Dan, leaving off reluctantly. "It looks very much like it, and feels like it, hey, Jack?" said Mr. Bear, as the defeated gentleman got upon his legs with difficulty. "Catch me wrestling with him again! He's most knocked my head off," snarled Jack, holding on to that portion of his frame as if it really was loose upon his shoulders. "The fact is, we began in fun, but when I got him down I couldn't help pounding him. Sorry I hurt you, old fellow," explained Dan, looking rather ashamed of himself. "I understand. The longing to pitch into somebody was so strong you couldn't resist. You are a sort of berserker, Dan, and something to tussle with is as necessary to you as music is to Nat," said Mr. Bear, who knew all about the conversation between the boy and Mrs. Joe. "Can't help it. So if you don't want to be pounded, you'd better keep out of the way," answered Dan, with a warning look in his black eyes that made Jack sheer off in haste. "If you want something to wrestle with, I will give you a tougher specimen than Jack," said Mr. Bear, and leading the way to the wood yard, he pointed out certain roots of trees that had been grubbed up in the spring and had been lying there waiting to be split. "There, when you feel inclined to maltreat the boys, just come and work off your energies here, and I'll thank you for it." "So I will," and seizing the axe that lay near, Dan hauled out a tough root and went at it so vigorously that the chips flew far and wide, and Mr. Bear fled for his life. To his great amusement, Dan took him at his word and was often seen wrestling with the ungainly knots, hat and jacket off, red face and wrathful eyes, for he got into royal rages over some of his adversaries, and swore at them under his breath till he had conquered them, when he exulted and marched off to the shed with an armful of gnarled oak wood in triumph. He blistered his hands, tired his back, and dulled the axe, but it did him good, and he got more comfort out of the ugly roots than any one dreamed, for with each blow he worked off some of the pent-up power that would otherwise have been expended in some less harmless way. "When this is gone, I really don't know what I shall do," said Mrs. Joe to herself, for no inspiration came, and she was at the end of her resources. But Dan found a new occupation for himself, and enjoyed it some time before any one discovered the cause of his contentment. A fine young horse of Mr. Lorry's was kept at Plumfield that summer, running loose in a large pasture across the brook. The boys were all interested in the handsome, spirited creature, and for a time were fond of watching him gallop and frisk with his plumy tail flying and his handsome head in the air. But they soon got tired of it and left Prince Charlie to himself. All but Dan. He never tired of looking at the horse, and seldom failed to visit him every day with a lump of sugar, a bit of bread, or an apple to make him welcome. Charlie was grateful, accepted his friendship, and the two loved one another as if they felt some tie between them, inexplicable but strong. In whatever part of the wide field he might be, Charlie always came at full speed when Dan whistled at the bars, and the boy was never happier than when the beautiful, fleet creature put its head on his shoulder, looking up at him with fine eyes full of intelligent affection. "We understand one another without any palaver, don't we, old fellow?" Dan would say, proud of the horse's confidence, and so jealous of his regard that he told no one how well the friendship prospered, and never asked anybody but Teddy to accompany him on these daily visits. Mr. Lorry came now and then to see how Charlie got on, and spoke of having him broken to harness in the autumn. "He won't need much taming, he is such a gentle, fine-tempered brute. I shall come out and try him with a saddle myself some day," he said on one of these visits. "He lets me put a halter on him, but I don't believe he will bear a saddle even if you put it on," answered Dan, who never failed to be present when Charlie and his master met. "I shall coax him to bear it, and not mind a few tumbles at first. He has never been harshly treated, so though he will be surprised at the new performance, I think he won't be frightened, and his antics will do no harm." "I wonder what he would do," said Dan to himself, as Mr. Lorry went away with the Professor, and Charlie returned to the bars, from which he had retired when the gentleman came up. A daring fancy to try the experiment took possession of the boy as he sat on the topmost rail, with a glossy back temptingly near him. Never thinking of danger, he obeyed the impulse, and while Charlie unsuspectingly nibbled at the apple he held, Dan quickly and quietly took his seat. He did not keep it long, however, for with an astonished snort, Charlie reared straight up and deposited Dan on the ground. The fall did not hurt him, for the turf was soft, and he jumped up, saying with a laugh, "I did it anyway. Come here, you rascal, and I'll try it again." But Charlie declined to approach, and Dan left him resolving to succeed in the end, for a struggle like this suited him exactly. Next time he took a halter, and having got it on, he played with the horse for a while, leading him to and fro, and putting him through various antics till he was a little tired. Then Dan sat on the wall and gave him bread, but watched his chance, and getting a good grip on the halter, slipped onto his back. Charlie tried the old trick, but Dan held on, having had practice with Toby, who occasionally had an obstinate fit, and tried to shake off his rider. Charlie was both amazed and indignant, and after prancing for a minute, set off at a gallop, and away went Dan, heels over head. If he had not belonged to the class of boys who go through all sorts of dangers unscathed, he would have broken his neck. As it was, he got a heavy fall, and lay still collecting his wits, while Charlie tore round the field, tossing his head with every sign of satisfaction at the discomfiture of his rider. Presently it seemed to occur to him that something was wrong with Dan, and being of a magnanimous nature, he went to see what the matter was. Dan let him sniff about and perplex himself for a few minutes. Then he looked up at him, saying, as decidedly as if the horse could understand, "You think you have beaten, but you are mistaken, old boy, and I'll ride you yet, see if I don't." He tried no more that day, but soon after attempted a new method of introducing Charlie to a burden. He strapped a folded blanket on his back, and then let him race and rear and roll, and fume as much as he liked. After a few fits of rebellion, Charlie submitted, and in a few days permitted Dan to mount him, often stopped short to look round as if to say, half patiently, half reproachfully, "I don't understand it, but I suppose you mean no harm, so I permit the liberty." Dan patted and praised him, and took a short turn every day, getting frequent falls, but persisting in spite of them, and longing to try a saddle and bridle, but not daring to confess what he had done. He had his wish, however, for there had been a witness of his pranks, who said a good word for him. "Do you know what that chap has been doin' lately?" asked Silas of his master one evening, as he received his orders for the next day. "Which boy?" said Mr. Bear, with an air of resignation, expecting some sad revelation. "Dan. He's been a breaking the colt, sir, and I wish I may die if he ain't done it," answered Silas, chuckling. "How do you know?" "Wall, I kinder keep an eye on the little fellers, and most gen'ally know what they're up to. So when Dan kept goin' off to the pastur', and comin' home black and blue, I mistrusted that sun'thin' was goin' on. I didn't say nothin', but I crep' up into the barn chamber, and from there I see him goin' through all manner of games with Charlie. Blest if he warn't throwed time and again, and knocked round like a bag of meal. But the pluck o' that boy did beat all, and he 'peared to like it, and kep' on as if bound to beat." "But, Silas, you should have stopped it. The boy might have been killed," said Mr. Bear, wondering what freak his irrepressibles would take into their heads next. "S'pose I oughter, but there warn't no real danger, for Charlie ain't no tricks, and is as pretty a tempered horse as ever I see. Fact was, I couldn't bear to spile the sport, for if there's anything I do admire, it's grit, and Dan is chock full of it. But now I know he's a hankerin' after a saddle, and yet won't take even the old one on the sly. So I just thought I'd up and tell, and maybe you'd let him try what he can do. Mr. Lorry won't mind, and Charlie's all the better for it." "We shall see." And off went Mr. Bear to inquire into the matter. Dan owned up at once, and proudly proved that Silas was right, by showing off his power over Charlie. For by dint of much coaxing, many carrots, and infinite perseverance, he really had succeeded in riding the colt with a halter and blanket. Mr. Lorry was much amused and well pleased with Dan's courage and skill, and let him have a hand in all future performances, for he set about Charlie's education at once, saying that he was not going to be outdone by a slip of a boy. Thanks to Dan, Charlie took kindly to the saddle and bridle when he had once reconciled himself to the indignity of the bit, and after Mr. Lorry had trained him a little, Dan was permitted to ride him, to the great envy and admiration of the other boys. "Isn't he handsome? And don't he mind me like a lamb?" said Dan one day as he dismounted and stood with his arm round Charlie's neck. "Yes, and isn't he a much more useful and agreeable animal than the wild colt, who spent his days racing about the field, "And running away now and then?" asked Mrs. Bear from the steps, where she always appeared when Dan performed with Charlie. "Of course he is. See, he won't run away now, even if I don't hold him, and he comes to me the minute I whistle. I have tamed him well, haven't I?" And Dan looked both proud and pleased, as well he might, for in spite of their struggles together, Charlie loved him better than his master. "I am taming a colt, too, and I think I shall succeed as well as you, if I am as patient and persevering," said Mrs. Joe, smiling so significantly at him that Dan understood and answered, laughing yet in earnest, "We won't jump over the fence and run away, but stay and let them make a handsome, useful span of us. Hey, Charlie?" Chapter 17 of Little Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Mary Anderson. Little Men, Life at Plumfield with Joe's Boys, by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 17, Composition Day. "Hurry up, boys, it's 3 o'clock, and Uncle Fritz likes us to be punctual, you know," said Franz, one Wednesday afternoon, as a bell rang, and a stream of literary-looking young gentlemen with books and paper in their hands were seen going toward the museum. Tommy was in the schoolroom, bending over his desk, much bedaubed with ink, flushed with the ardor of inspiration, and in a great hurry, as usual, for easy-going Bangs never was ready till the very last minute. As Franz passed the door looking up laggards, Tommy gave one last blot and flourish, and departed out of the window, waving his paper to dry as he went. Nan followed, looking very important, with a large roll in her hand, and Demi escorted Daisy, both evidently brimful of some delightful secret. The museum was all in order, and the sunshine among the hop vines made pretty shadows on the floor as it peeped through the great window. On one side sat Mr. and Mrs. Bear, on the other was a little table on which the compositions were laid as soon as read, and in a large semicircle sat the children on camp stools, which occasionally shut up and let the sitter down, thus preventing any stiffness in the assembly. As it took too much time to have all read, they took turns, and on this Wednesday the younger pupils were the chief performers, while the elder ones listened with condescension and criticized freely. "Ladies first, so Nan may begin," said Mr. Bear, when the settling of stools and rustling of papers had subsided. Nan took her place beside the little table, and with a preliminary giggle read the following interesting essay on the sponge. "The sponge, my friends, is a most useful and interesting plant. It grows on rocks under the water, and is a kind of seaweed, I believe. People go and pick it, and dry it, and wash it, because little fish and insects live in the holes of the sponge. I found shells in my new one, and sand. Some are very fine and soft. Babies are washed with them. The sponge has many uses. I will relate some of them, and I hope my friends will remember what I say. One use is to wash the face. I don't like it myself, but I do it because I wish to be clean. Some people don't, and they are dirty." Here the eye of the reader rested sternly upon Dick and Dolly, who quailed under it, and instantly resolved to scrub themselves virtuously on all occasions. "Another use is to wake people up. I allude to boys particularly." Another pause after the long word to enjoy the smothered laugh that went round the room. "Some boys do not get up when called, and Mary Ann squeezes the water out of a wet sponge on their faces, and it makes them so mad they wake up." Here the laugh broke out, and Emil said, as if he had been hit, "Seems to me you are wandering from the subject." "No, I ain't. We are to write about vegetables or animals, and I'm doing both. For boys are animals, aren't they?" cried Nan, and undaunted by the indignant "No" shouted at her, she calmly proceeded. One more interesting thing is done with sponges, and this is when doctors put ether on it, and hold it to people's noses when they have teeth out. I shall do this when I am bigger, and give ether to the sick, so they will go to sleep and not feel me cut off their legs and arms." "I know somebody who killed cats with it," called out Demi, but was promptly crushed by Dan, who upset his camp stool and put a hat over his face. "I will not be interrupted," said Nan, frowning upon the unseemly scrimmagers. Order was instantly restored, and the young lady closed her remarks as follows: "My composition has 3 morals, my friends." Somebody groaned, but no notice was taken of the insult. "First is, keep your faces clean. Second, get up early. Third, when the ether sponge is put over your nose, breathe hard and don't kick, and your teeth will come out easy. I have no more to say." And Miss Nan sat down amid tumultuous applause. "That is a very remarkable composition. Its tone is high, and there is a good deal of humor in it. Very well done, Nan. Now, Daisy." And Mr. Bear smiled at one young lady as he beckoned the other. Daisy colored prettily as she took her place, and said in her modest little voice, "I'm afraid you won't like mine. It isn't nice and funny like Nan's, but I couldn't do any better." "We always like yours, Posy," said Uncle Fritz, and a gentle murmur from the boys seemed to confirm the remark. Thus encouraged, Daisy read her little paper, which was listened to with respectful attention. The Cat. The cat is a sweet animal. I love them very much. They are clean and pretty, and catch rats and mice, and let you pet them, and are fond of you if you are kind. They are very wise, and can find their way anywhere. Little cats are called kittens, and are dear things. I have 2, named Huzz and Buzz, and their mother is Topaz, because she has yellow eyes. Uncle told me a pretty story about a man named Mahomet. He had a nice cat, and when she was asleep on his sleeve and he wanted to go away, he cut off the sleeve so as not to wake her up. I think he was a kind man. Some cats catch fish." "So do I!" cried Teddy, jumping up eager to tell about his trout. "Hush!" said his mother, setting him down again as quickly as possible, for orderly Daisy hated to be interrupted, as Nan expressed it. "I read about one who used to do it very slyly. I tried to make Topaz, but she did not like the water, and scratched me. She does like tea, and when I play in my kitchen she pats the teapot with her paw till I give her some. She is a fine cat. She eats apple pudding and molasses. Most cats do not." "That's a first-rater," called out Nat, and Daisy retired, pleased with the praise of her friend. "Demi looks so impatient we must have him up at once, or he won't hold out," said Uncle Fritz, and Demi skipped up with alacrity. "Mine is a poem," he announced in a tone of triumph, and read his first effort in a loud and solemn voice. "I write about the butterfly. It is a pretty thing, and flies about like the birds, but it does not sing. First it is a little grub, and then it is a nice yellow cocoon, and then the butterfly eats its way out soon. They live on dew and honey. They do not have any hive. They do not sting like wasps and bees and hornets, and to be as good as they are we should strive. I should like to be a beautiful butterfly, all yellow and blue and green and red, but I should not like to have Dan put camphor on my poor little head." This unusual burst of genius brought down the house, and Demi was obliged to read it again, a somewhat difficult task, as there was no punctuation whatever, and the little poet's breath gave out before he got to the end of some of the long lines. "He will be a Shakespeare yet," said Aunt Jo, laughing as if she would die, for this poetic gem reminded her of one of her own, written at the age of 10, and beginning gloomily, "I wish I had a quiet tomb beside a little rill, where birds and bees and butterflies would sing upon the hill." "Come on, Tommy. If there is as much ink inside your paper as there is outside, it will be a long composition," said Mr. Bear, when Demi had been induced to tear himself from his poem and sit down. "It isn't a composition, it's a letter. You see, I forgot all about its being my turn till after school, and then I didn't know what to have, and there wasn't time to read up, so I thought you wouldn't mind my taking a letter that I wrote to my grandma. It's got something about birds in it, so I thought it would do." With this long excuse, Tommy plunged into a sea of ink and floundered through, pausing now and then to decipher one of his own flourishes. "My dear Grandma, I hope you are well. Uncle James sent me a pocket rifle. It is a beautiful little instrument of killing, shaped like this." Here Tommy displayed a remarkable sketch of what looked like an intricate pump or the inside of a small steam engine. 44 are the sights. 6 is a false stock that fits in at A. 3 is the trigger, and 2 is the cock. It loads at the breech and fires with great force and straightness. I'm going out shooting squirrels soon. I shot several fine birds for the museum. They had speckled breasts, and Dan liked them very much. He stuffed them tip-top, and they sit on the tree quite natural, only one looks a little tipsy. We had a Frenchman working here the other day, and Asia called his name so funnily that I will tell you about it. His name was Germain. First she called him Jerry, but we laughed at her, and she changed it to Jeremiah. But ridicule was the result, so it became Mr. Germany. But ridicule having been again resumed, it became Jerrymon, which it has remained ever since. I do not write often, I am so busy, but I think of you often, and sympathize with you, and sincerely hope you get on as well as can be expected, without me. Your affectionate grandson, Thomas Buckminster Bangs. P.S. ? If you come across any postage stamps, remember me. N.B. Love to all, and a great deal to Aunt Elmira. Does she make any nice plum cakes now? P.S. ? Mrs. Bear sends her respects. P.S. ? And so would Mr. B. if he knew I was in act to write. N.B. Father is going to give me a watch on my birthday. I am glad, as at present I have no means of telling time, and am often late at school. P.S. ? I hope to see you soon. Don't you wish to send for me? T.B.B. As each postscript was received with a fresh laugh from the boys, by the time he came to the sixth and last, Tommy was so exhausted that he was glad to sit down and wipe his ruddy face. "I hope the dear old lady will live through it," said Mr. Bear, under cover of the noise. "We won't take any notice of the broad hint given in that last P.S. The letter will be quite as much as she can bear without a visit from Tommy," answered Mrs. Joe, remembering that the old lady usually took to her bed after a visitation from her irrepressible grandson. "Now me," said Teddy, who had learned a bit of poetry, and was so eager to say it that he had been bobbing up and down during the reading, and could no longer be restrained. "I'm afraid he will forget it if he waits, and I have had a deal of trouble teaching him," said his mother. Teddy trotted to the rostrum, dropped a curtsy, and nodded his head at the same time, as if anxious to suit every one. Then, in his baby voice, and putting the emphasis on the wrong words, he said his verse all in one breath. "Little drops of water, little drains of sand, mate a mite oakum (ocean), and a peasant land. Little words of kindness, poken every day, make a home a heaven, and help us on a way." Clapping his hands at the end, he made another double salutation, and then ran to hide his head in his mother's lap, quite overcome by the success of his piece, for the applause was tremendous. Dick and Dolly did not write, but were encouraged to observe the habits of animals and insects, and report what they saw. Dick liked this, and always had a great deal to say, so when his name was called he marched up, and looking at the audience with his bright, confiding eyes, told his little story so earnestly that no one smiled at his crooked body, because the straight soul shone through it beautifully. I've been watching dragonflies, and I read about them in Dan's book, and I'll try and tell you what I remember. There's lots of them flying round on the pond, all blue with big eyes and sort of lace wings, very pretty. I caught one and looked at him, and I think he was the handsomest insect I ever saw. They catch littler creatures than they are to eat, and have a queer kind of hook thing that folds up when they ain't hunting. It likes the sunshine and dances round all day. Let me see, what else was there to tell about? Oh, I know. The eggs are laid in the water and go down to the bottom and are hatched in the mud. Little ugly things come out of 'em. I can't say the name, but they are brown and keep having new skins and getting bigger and bigger. Only think! It takes them 2 years to be a dragonfly. Now this is the curious part of it, so you listen tight, for I don't believe you know it. When it is ready, it knows somehow, and the ugly grubby thing climbs up out of the water on a flag or a bulrush and bursts open its back. Come, I don't believe that, said Tommy, who was not an observant boy, and really thought Dick was making up. It does burst open its back, don't it? And Dick appealed to Mr. Bear, who nodded a very decided affirmative, to the little speaker's great satisfaction. Well, out comes the dragonfly all whole, and he sits in the sun sort of coming alive, you know, and he gets strong, and then he spreads his pretty wings and flies away up in the air, and never is a grub any more. That's all I know, but I shall watch and try to see him do it, for I think it's splendid to turn into a beautiful dragonfly, don't you? Dick had told his story well, and when he described the flight of the newborn insect, had waved his hands and looked as if he saw and wanted to follow it. Something in his face suggested to the minds of the elder listeners the thought that some day little Dick would have his wish, and after years of helplessness and pain would climb up into the sun some happy day, and leaving his poor little body behind him, find a new lovely shape in a fairer world than this. Mrs. Joe drew him to her side and said, with a kiss on his thin cheek, "That is a sweet little story, dear, and you remembered it wonderfully well. I shall write and tell your mother all about it." And Dick sat on her knee, contentedly smiling at the praise, and resolving to watch well and catch the dragonfly in the act of leaving its old body for the new, and see how he did it. Dolly had a few remarks to make upon "the duck," and made them in a sing-song tone, for he had learned it by heart, and thought it a great plague to do it at all. Wild ducks are hard to kill. Men hide and shoot at them, and have tame ducks to quack and make the wild ones come where the men can fire at them. They have wooden ducks made too, and they sail round, and the wild ones come to see them. They are stupid, I think. Our ducks are very tame. They eat a great deal, and go poking round in the mud and water. They don't take good care of their eggs, but them spoil, and mine don't," cried Tommy. "Well, some people's do. Silas said so. Hens take good care of little ducks, only they don't like to have them go in the water and make a great fuss. But the little ones don't care a bit. I like to eat ducks with stuffing in them and lots of apple sauce." "I have something to say about owls," began Nat, who had carefully prepared a paper upon this subject, with some help from Dan. "Owls have big heads, round eyes, hooked bills, and strong claws. Some are gray, some white, some black and yellowish. Their feathers are very soft, and stick out a great deal. They fly very quietly and hunt bats, mice, little birds, and such things. They build nests in barns, hollow trees, and some take the nests of other birds. The great horned owl has 2 eggs bigger than a hen's, and reddish brown. The tawny owl has 5 eggs, white and smooth. And this is the kind that hoots at night. Another kind sounds like a child crying. They eat mice and bats whole, and the parts that they cannot digest they make into little balls and spit out." "My gracious, how funny!" Nan was heard to observe. "They cannot see by day, and if they get out into the light they go flapping around half blind. and the other birds chase and peck at them, as if they were making fun. The horned owl is very big, most as big as the eagle. It eats rabbits, rats, snakes, and birds, and lives in rocks and old tumble-down houses. They have a good many cries, and scream like a person being choked, and say, "Wow! Wow!" and it scares people at night in the woods. The white owl lives by the sea and in cold places, and looks something like a hawk. There is a kind of owl that makes holes to live in like moles. It is called the burrowing owl, and is very small. The barn owl is the commonest kind, and I have watched one sitting in a hole in a tree, looking like a little gray cat, with one eye shut and the other open. He comes out at dusk and sits round watching for the bats. I caught one, and here he is." With that Nat suddenly produced from inside his jacket a little downy bird, who blinked and ruffled his feathers, looking very plump and sleepy and scared. "Don't touch him. He is going to show off," said Nat, displaying his new pet with great pride. First he put a cocked hat on the bird's head, and the boys laughed at the funny effect. Then he added a pair of paper spectacles, and that gave the owl such a wise look that they shouted with merriment. The performance closed with making the bird angry, and seeing him cling to a handkerchief upside down, pecking and clucking, as Rob called it. He was allowed to fly after that, and settled himself on the bunch of pine cones over the door, where he sat staring down at the company with an air of sleepy dignity that amused them very much. "Have you anything for us, George?" asked Mr. Bear, when the room was still again. "Well, I read and learned ever so much about moles, but I declare I've forgotten every bit of it, except that they dig holes to live in, that you catch them by pouring water down, and that they can't possibly live without eating very often." And Stuffy sat down, wishing he had not been too lazy to write out his valuable observations, for a general smile went round when he mentioned the last of the 3 facts, which lingered in his memory. "Then we are done for to-day," began Mr. Bear, but Tommy called out in a great hurry, "No, we ain't. Don't you know? We must give the thing," and he winked violently as he made an eyeglass of his fingers. "Bless my heart, I forgot! Now is your time, Tom." And Mr. Bear dropped into his seat again, while all the boys but Dan looked mightily tickled at something. Nat, Tommy, and Demi left the room, and speedily returned with a little red morocco box set forth in state on Mrs. Joe's best silver salver. Tommy bore it, and, still escorted by Nat and Demi, marched up to unsuspecting Dan, who stared at them as if he thought they were going to make fun of him. Tommy had prepared an elegant and impressive speech for the occasion, but when the minute came it all went out of his head, and he just said, straight from his kindly boyish heart, "Here, old fellow, we all wanted to give you something to kind of pay for what happened a while ago, and to show how much we liked you for being such a trump. Please take it, and have a jolly good time with it." Dan was so surprised he could only get as red as the little box, and mutter, "Thank ye, boys," as he fumbled to open it. But when he saw what was inside, his face lighted up, and he seized the long-desired treasure, saying so enthusiastically that every one was satisfied, though his language was anything but polished. "What a stunner! I say, you fellows are regular bricks to give me this. It's just what I wanted. Give us your paw, Tommy." Many paws were given and heartily shaken, for the boys were charmed with Dan's pleasure, and crowded round him to shake hands and expatiate on the beauties of their gift. In the midst of this pleasant chatter Dan's eye went to Mrs. Joe, who stood outside the group enjoying the scene with all her heart. "No, I had nothing to do with it. The boys got it up all themselves," she said, answering the grateful look that seemed to thank her for that happy moment. Dan smiled and said, in a tone that only she could understand, "It's you all the same," and making his way through the boys, he held out his hand first to her and then to the good Professor, who was beaming benevolently on his flock. He thanked them both with a silent, hearty squeeze he gave the kind hands that had held him up, and led him into the safe refuge of a happy home. Not a word was spoken, but they felt all he would say, and little Teddy expressed his pleasure for them as he leaned from his father's arm to hug the boy and say, in his baby way, "My dood Danny! Everybody loves him now." "Come here, show off your spy-glass, Dan, and let us see some of your magnified pollywogs and Annie-Malcolmisms, as you call 'em," said Jack, who felt so uncomfortable during this scene that he would have slipped away if Emil had not kept him. "So I will. Take a squint at that and see what you think of it," said Dan, glad to show off his precious microscope. He held it over a beetle that happened to be lying on the table, and Jack bent down to take his squint, but looked up with an amazed face, saying, "My eye, what nippers the old thing has got! I see now why it hurts so confoundedly when you grab a door bug and he grabs back again." "He winked at me!" cried Nan, who had poked her head under Jack's elbow and got the second peep. Every one took a look, and then Dan showed them the lovely plumage on a moth's wing, the 4 feathery corners to a hair, the veins on a leaf, hardly visible to the naked eye, but like a thick net through the wonderful little glass, the skin on their own fingers, looking like queer hills and valleys, a cobweb like a bit of coarse sewing silk, and the sting of a bee. "It's like the fairy spectacles in my story book, only more curious," said Demi, enchanted with the wonders he saw. Dan is a magician now, and he can show you many miracles going on all round you, for he has 2 things needful, patience and a love of nature. We live in a beautiful and wonderful world, Demi, and the more you know about it, the wiser and the better you will be. This little glass will give you a new set of teachers, and you may learn fine lessons from them if you will," said Mr. Bear, glad to see how interested the boys were in the matter. "Could I see anybody's soul with this microscope if I looked hard?" asked Demi, who was much impressed with the power of the bit of glass. "No, dear, it's not powerful enough for that, and never can be made so. You must wait a long while before your eyes are clear enough to see the most invisible of God's wonders. But looking at the lovely things you can see will help you to understand the lovelier things you cannot see," answered Uncle Fritz, with his hand on the boy's head. "Well, Daisy and I both think that if there are any angels, their wings look like that butterfly's as we see it through the glass, only more soft and gold. Believe it if you like, and keep your own little wings as bright and beautiful, only don't fly away for a long time yet." "No, I won't," and Demi kept his word. "Good-bye, my boys. I must go now, but I leave you with our new professor of natural history," and Mrs. Joe went away well pleased with that composition day. End of Chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Little Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Mary Anderson. Little Men, Life at Plumfield with Joe's Boys by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 18, Crops. The gardens did well that summer, and in September the little crops were gathered in with much rejoicing. Jack and Ned joined their farms and raised potatoes, those being a good saleable article. They got 12 bushels, counting little ones and all, and sold them to Mr. Bear at a fair price, for potatoes went fast in that house. Emil and Franz devoted themselves to corn, and had a jolly little husking in the barn, after which they took their corn to the mill, and came proudly home with meal enough to supply the family with hasty pudding and johnny cake for a long time. They would not take money for their crop, because, as Franz said, "We never can pay Uncle for all he has done for us if we raised corn for the rest of our days." Nat had beans in such abundance that he despaired of ever shelling them, till Mrs. Joe proposed a new way, which succeeded admirably. The dry pods were spread upon the barn floor. Nat fiddled, and the boys danced quadrilles on them, till they were thrashed out with much merriment and very little labor. Tommy's 6 weeks' beans were a failure, for a dry spell early in the season hurt them, because he gave them no water, and after that he was so sure that they could take care of themselves, he let the poor things struggle with bugs and weeds till they were exhausted and died a lingering death. So Tommy had to dig his farm over again and plant peas. But they were late. The birds ate many. The bushes, not being firmly planted, blew down, and when the poor peas came at last, no one cared for them, as their day was over, and spring lamb had grown into mutton. Tommy consoled himself with a charitable effort, for he transplanted all the thistles he could find, and tended them carefully for Toby, who was fond of the prickly delicacy, and had eaten all he could find on the place. The boys had great fun over Tom's thistle bed, but he insisted that it was better to care for poor Toby than for himself, and declared that he would devote his entire farm next year to thistles, worms, and snails, and that Demi's turtles and Net's pet owl might have the food they loved, as well as the donkey. So like shiftless, kind-hearted, happy-go-lucky Tommy. Demi had supplied his grandmother with lettuce all summer, and in the autumn sent his grandfather a basket of turnips, each one scrubbed up till it looked like a great white egg. His grandma was fond of salad, and one of his grandpa's favorite quotations was, "Lucullus, whom frugality could charm, ate roasted turnips at the Sabine farm." Therefore these vegetable offerings to the dear domestic god and goddess were affectionate, appropriate, and classical. Daisy had nothing but flowers in her little plot, and it bloomed all summer long with a succession of gay or fragrant posies. She was very fond of her garden, and delved away in it at all hours, watching over her roses and pansies, sweet peas, and mignonette, as faithfully and tenderly as she did over her dolls or her friends. Little nosegays were sent into town on all occasions, and certain vases about the house were her especial care. She had all sorts of pretty fancies about her flowers, and loved to tell the children the story of the pansy, and show them how the stepmother leaf sat up in her green chair in purple and gold, how the two own children in gay yellow had each its little seat, while the step-children in dull colors both sat on one small stool, and the poor little father in his red nightcap was kept out of sight in the middle of the flower, that a monk's dark face looked out of the monk's hood larkspur, that the flowers of the canary vine were so like dainty birds fluttering their yellow wings, that one almost expected to see them fly away, and the snapdragons that went off like little pistol shots when you cracked them. Splendid dollies did she make out of scarlet and white poppies, with ruffled robes tied round the waist, with grass-blade sashes, and astonishing hats of coreopsis on their green heads. Pea-pod boats, with rose-leaf sails, received these flower people, and floated them about a placid pool in the most charming style. For finding that there were no elves, Daisy made her own, and loved the fanciful little friends who played their parts in her summer life. Nan went in for herbs, and had a fine display of useful plants, which she tended with steadily increasing interest and care. Very busy was she in September, cutting, drying, and tying up her sweet harvest, and writing down in a little book how the different herbs are to be used. She had tried several experiments, and made several mistakes, so she wished to be particular lest she should give little Huz another fit by administering wormwood instead of catnip. Dick, Dolly, and Rob each grubbed away on his small farm, and made more stir about it than all the rest put together. Parsnips and carrots were the crop of the 2Ds, and they longed for it to be late enough to pull up the precious vegetables. Dick did privately examine his carrots and plant them again, feeling that Silas was right in saying that it was too soon for them yet. Rob's crop was 4 small squashes and 1 immense pumpkin. It really was a bouncer, as every one said, and I assure you that 2 small persons could sit on it side by side. It seemed to have absorbed all the goodness of the little garden and all the sunshine that shone down on it, and lay there a great round golden ball full of rich suggestions of pumpkin pies for weeks to come. Robbie was so proud of his mammoth vegetable that he took every one to see it, and when frosts began to nip, covered it up each night with an old bedquilt, tucking it round as if the pumpkin was a well-beloved baby. The day it was gathered he would let no one touch it but himself, and nearly broke his back tugging it to the barn in his little wheelbarrow, with Dick and Dolly harnessed in front to give a heave up the path. His mother promised him that the Thanksgiving pies should be made from it, and hinted vaguely that she had a plan in her head which would cover the prize pumpkin and its owner with glory. Poor Billy had planted cucumbers, but unfortunately hoed them up and left the pigweed. This mistake grieved him very much for 10 minutes. Then he forgot all about it and sewed a handful of bright buttons which he collected, evidently thinking in his feeble mind that they were money, and would come up and multiply so that he might make many quarters as Tommy did. No one disturbed him, and he did what he liked with his plot, which soon looked as if a series of small earthquakes had stirred it up. When the general harvest day came, he would have nothing but stones and weeds to show, if kind old Asia had not hung 6 oranges on the dead tree he stuck up in the middle. Billy was delighted with his crop, and no one spoiled his pleasure in the little miracle which pity wrought for him, by making withered branches bear strange fruit. Stuffy had various trials with his melons, for being impatient to taste them, he had a solitary revel before they were ripe, and made himself so ill that for a day or two it seemed doubtful if he would ever eat any more. But he pulled through and served up his first cantaloupe without tasting a mouthful himself. They were excellent melons, for he had a warm slope for them, and they ripened fast. The last and best were lingering on the vines, and Stuffy had announced that he should sell them to a neighbor. This disappointed the boys, who had hoped to eat the melons themselves, and they expressed their displeasure in a new and striking manner. Going one morning to gaze upon the 3 fine watermelons which he had kept for the market, Stuffy was horrified to find the word P.I.G. cut in white letters on the green rind, staring at him from every one. He was in a great rage, and flew to Mrs. Joe for redress. She listened, condoled with him, and then said, "If you want to turn the laugh, I'll tell you how, but you must give up the melons." "Well, I will, for I can't thrash all the boys, but I'd like to give them something to remember, the mean sneaks," growled Stuffy, still in a fume. Now Mrs. Joe was pretty sure who had done the trick, for she had seen 3 heads suspiciously near to one another in the sofa corner the evening before, and when these heads had nodded with chuckles and whispers, this experienced woman knew mischief was afoot. A moonlit night, a rustling in the old cherry tree near Emil's window, a cut on Tommy's finger, all helped to confirm her suspicions, and having cooled Stuffy's wrath a little, she bade him bring his maltreated melons to her room, and say not a word to any one of what had happened. He did so, and the 3 wags were amazed to find their joke so quietly taken. It spoilt the fun, and the entire disappearance of the melons made them uneasy. So did Stuffy's good nature, for he looked more placid and plump than ever, and surveyed them with an air of calm pity that perplexed them very much. At dinner time they discovered why, for then Stuffy's vengeance fell upon them, and the laugh was turned against them. When the pudding was eaten and the fruit was put on, Mary Ann reappeared in a high state of giggle, bearing a large watermelon. Silas followed with another, and Dan brought up the rear with a third. One was placed before each of the 3 guilty lads, and they read on the smooth green skins this addition to their own work: "With the compliments of the pig." Every one else read it also, and the whole table was in a roar, for the trick had been whispered about, so every one understood the sequel. Emil, Ned, and Tommy did not know where to look, and had not a word to say for themselves, so they wisely joined in the laugh, cut up the melons, and handed them round, saying, what all the rest agreed to, that Stuffy had taken a wise and merry way to return good for evil. Dan had no garden, for he was away or lame the greater part of the summer, so he had helped Silas wherever he could, chopped wood for Asia, and taken care of the lawn so well that Mrs. Joe always had smooth paths and nicely shaven turf before her door. When the others got in their crops, he looked sorry that he had so little to show, but as autumn went on he bethought himself of a woodland harvest which no one would dispute with him, and which was peculiarly his own. Every Saturday he was away alone to the forests, fields, and hills, and always came back loaded with spoils, for he seemed to know the meadows where the best flagroot grew, the thicket where the sassafras was spiciest, the haunts where the squirrels went for nuts, the white oak whose bark was most valuable, and the little gold-thread vine that Nursey liked to cure the canker with. All sorts of splendid red and yellow leaves did Dan bring home for Mrs. Joe to dress her parlor with, graceful seeded grasses, clematis tassels, downy soft yellow waxwork berries, and mosses red-brimmed, white, or emerald green. I need not sigh for the woods now, because Dan brings the woods to me, Mrs. Joe used to say, as she glorified the walls with yellow maple boughs and scarlet woodbine wreaths, or filled her vases with russet ferns, hemlock sprays full of delicate cones, and hardy autumn flowers, for Dan's crops suited her well. The great garret was full of the children's little stores, and for a time was one of the sights of the house. Daisy's flower seeds, in neat little paper bags, all labeled, lay in a drawer of a three-legged table. Nan's herbs hung in bunches against the wall, filling the air with their aromatic breath. Tommy had a basket of thistledown with the tiny seeds attached, for he meant to plant them next year, if they did not all fly away before that time. Emil had bunches of popcorn hanging there to dry, and Demi laid up acorns and different sorts of grain for the pets. But Dan's crop made the best show, for fully one half of the floor was covered with the nuts he brought. All kinds were there, for he ranged the woods for miles round, climbed the tallest trees, and forced his way into the thickest hedges for his plunder. Walnuts, chestnuts, hazelnuts, and beechnuts lay in separate compartments, getting brown and dry and sweet, ready for winter revels. There was one butternut tree on the place, and Rob and Teddy called it theirs. It bore well this year, and the great dingy nuts came dropping down to hide among the dead leaves, where the busy squirrels found them better than the lazy bears. Their father had told them, the boys, not the squirrels, they should have the nuts if they would pick them up, but no one was to help. It was easy work, and Teddy liked it, only he soon got tired and left his little basket half full for another day. But the other day was slow to arrive, and meantime the sly squirrels were hard at work, scampering up and down the old elm trees, stowing the nuts away till their holes were full, then all about the crotches of the boughs to be removed at their leisure. Their funny little ways amused the boys till one day Silas said, "Have you sold them nuts to the squirrels?" "No," answered Rob, wondering what Silas meant. "Wall, then, you'd better fly round, or them spry little fellers won't leave you none." "Oh, we can beat them when we begin. There are such lots of nuts, we shall have a plenty." "There ain't many more to come down, and they have cleared the ground pretty well, see if they hain't." Robbie ran to look, and was alarmed to find how few remained. He called Teddy, and they worked hard all one afternoon, while the squirrels sat on the fence and scolded. "Now, Ted, we must keep watch, and pick up just as fast as they fall, or we shan't have more than a bushel, and every one will laugh at us if we don't." "The naughty quillies! Tarn't have 'em! I'll pick fast and run and put 'em in the barn, twick!" said Teddy, frowning at little Frisky, who chattered and whisked his tail indignantly. That night a high wind blew down hundreds of nuts, and when Mrs. Joe came to wake her little sons, she said briskly, "Come, my laddies, the squirrels are hard at it, and you will have to work well to-day, or they will have every nut on the ground." "No, they won't." And Robbie tumbled up in a great hurry, gobbled his breakfast, and rushed out to save his property. Teddy went too, and worked like a little beaver, trotting to and fro with full and empty baskets. Another bushel was soon put away in the corn barn, and they were scrambling among the leaves for more nuts when the bell rang for school. "Oh, father, let me stay out and pick. Those horrid squirrels will have my nuts if you don't. I'll do my lessons by and by," cried Rob, running into the schoolroom, flushed and tousled by the fresh cold wind and his eager work. "If you had been up early and done a little every morning, there would be no hurry now. I told you that, Rob, and you never minded. I cannot have the lessons neglected as the work has been. The squirrels will get more than their share this year, and they deserve it, for they have worked best. You may go an hour earlier, but that is all." And Mr. Bear led Rob to his place, where the little man dashed at his books as if bent on making sure of the precious hour promised him. It was almost maddening to sit still and see the wind shaking down the last nuts, and the lively thieves flying about, pausing now and then to eat one in his face, and flit their tails, as if they said saucily, "We'll have them in spite of you, lazy Rob." The only thing that sustained the poor child in this trying moment was the sight of Teddy working away all alone. It was really splendid, the pluck and perseverance of the little lad. He picked and picked till his back ached, he trudged to and fro till his small legs were tired, and he defied wind, weariness, and wicked quillies till his mother left her work and did the carrying for him, full of admiration for the kind little fellow who tried to help his brother. When Rob was dismissed, he found Teddy reposing in the bushel basket quite used up, but unwilling to quit the field, for he flapped his hat at the thieves with one grubby little hand, while he refreshed himself with the big apple held in the other. Rob fell to work, and the ground was cleared before 2 o'clock, the nuts safely in the corn barn loft, and the weary workers exulted in their success. But Frisky and his wife were not to be vanquished so easily, and when Rob went up to look at his nuts a few days later, he was amazed to see how many had vanished. None of the boys could have stolen them, because the door had been locked. The doves could not have eaten them, and there were no rats about. There was great lamentation among the young bears, till Dick said, "I saw Frisky on the roof of the corn barn. Maybe he took them." "I know he did. I'll have a trap and kill him dead," cried Rob, disgusted with Frisky's grasping nature. "Perhaps, if you watch, you can find out where he puts them, and I may be able to get them back for you," said Dan, who was much amused by the fight between the boys and the squirrels. So Rob watched, and saw Mr. and Mrs. Frisky drop from the drooping elm boughs onto the roof of the corn barn, dodge in at one of the little doors, much to the disturbance of the doves, and come out with a nut in each mouth, so laden they could not get back the way they came, but ran down the low roof along the wall, and leaping off at a corner, they vanished a minute and reappeared without their plunder. Rob ran to the place, and in a hollow under the leaves he found a heap of the stolen property, hidden away to be carried off to the holes by and by. "Oh, you little villains, I'll cheat you now, and not leave one," said Rob. So he cleared the corner and the corn barn, and put the contested nuts in the garret, making sure that no broken window pane could anywhere let in the unprincipled squirrels. They seemed to feel that the contest was over, and retired to their hole, but now and then could not resist throwing down nutshells on Rob's head, and scolding violently as if they could not forgive him nor forget that he had the best of the battle. Father and Mother Bear's crop was of a different sort, and not so easily described, but they were satisfied with it, felt that their summer work had prospered well, and by had a harvest that made them very happy. CHAPTER XIX.